I was working nights at the time, driving a delivery truck for a regional supply company. It paid steadily, and the hours fit my life then. I was in my late 20s, living alone. I slept during the day, kept to myself, and didn't have many obligations pulling me back into a normal schedule. The work itself was repetitive. We moved equipment and packaged materials between warehouses, clinics, and a few industrial sites that ran around the clock. Most nights followed the same rhythm. Clock in, check the truck, load the manifests, drive quiet highways, unload, repeat. There was nothing especially dangerous about it, just long stretches of driving and the dull alertness that comes with staying awake while the rest of the world sleeps. On that particular night, I was paired with a coworker named Daniel. We weren't close friends, but we'd worked together enough to be comfortable. He was a few years older than me, married, had kids, and talked about them often. He took night shifts because it paid a little extra, and because, as he put it, someone's got to do it. He was steady, reliable, and not the type to exaggerate or mess around on the job. Our route that night was straightforward. We had a scheduled drop at a small distribution facility on the far side of town, then a return trip back toward the main depot. The delivery itself went smoothly. We backed the truck into the bay, unloaded the pallets, got signatures, and were back on the road within half an hour. By the time we finished, it was well past midnight. We hadn't eaten since before our shift started, and both of us were hungry. There was a 24-hour diner a few miles away, just off the highway, a place we sometimes stopped if the schedule allowed. We decided to go there, park the truck in the lot, and grab something quick. The diner was mostly empty. A couple of truckers sat at the counter, and a waitress wiped down tables with the bored efficiency of someone halfway through a long shift. We ate, talked about work, about his kids' school schedules, about nothing important. I remember checking the time more than once, mostly out of habit. There was no sense of urgency. When we left, the parking lot was quiet. The truck sat where we'd left it, backed into a space away from the main entrance. Nothing looked out of place. We climbed back into the cab, Daniel in the driver's seat, me in the passenger seat. He turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. Almost immediately, we both froze. There was someone in the back. The cab was separated from the cargo area by a metal wall, but there was a small access door we sometimes used. That door was closed, but we could hear movement behind it. Daniel shut off the engine. The sudden silence made everything feel louder. We sat there listening. There was a faint sound again, unmistakably human. "Did you hear that?" he asked, even though it was obvious I had. "Yeah," I said. "There's someone back there." Our first assumption was that someone had broken in while we were inside the diner. It didn't make sense, but it was the only explanation that came to mind. The truck had been locked, but older models like ours weren't hard to get into if you knew what you were doing. Daniel grabbed the flashlight we kept between the seats. He hesitated, but opened his door and stepped down onto the pavement. I followed him around to the back of the truck. The lot lights cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the diner's windows glowed softly behind us. He unlocked the rear doors and pulled them open. Inside, crouched between two stacks of empty pallets, was a woman. She looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s. Her hair was dark, pulled back loosely, with strands falling into her face. She was wearing jeans and a light jacket, nothing that stood out. Her eyes were wide, fixed on us, and she had her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Please," she said immediately. Her voice was low and urgent. "Please don't tell anyone I'm here." Daniel and I exchanged a look. Neither of us knew what to say. This wasn't a situation we'd ever talked about, never mind prepared for. "What are you doing in our truck?" Daniel asked. His tone wasn't aggressive. "I just need somewhere to hide," she said, "just for a little while." I noticed then that she was shaking, whether from cold, fear, or something else I couldn't tell. "Hide from who?" I asked. She shook her head. "I can't say. Please, they can't find me." Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You can't be back here. This is a work vehicle." "I know," she said quickly. "I know. I'm sorry. Please, just for a bit." There was a pause. The three of us stood there. I didn't feel angry so much as unsettled. The fact that she'd managed to get into the truck unnoticed was disturbing enough. The way she spoke, like she was bracing herself for something, made it worse. "I can call the police," I said. It seemed like the most reasonable option. "They can help you." Her reaction was immediate and intense. "No," she said almost sharply. "No police, please, you can't call them." That raised a different kind of concern. I wasn't thinking about crime or anything dramatic. I was thinking about how little we knew and how wrong the whole situation felt. "If you're in danger," Daniel said, "they're the ones who can help." She stood up then, backing toward the open doors. "They won't," she said. "They'll just bring me back." "Bring you back where?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just looked past us, toward the dark edge of the parking lot, like she was listening for something. I thought she might run, and then she did. She slipped past us, jumped down from the truck, and took off across the lot. She moved fast, faster than I expected. Within seconds, she was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond the diner's lights. Daniel and I stood there, stunned. "Did that just happen?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "It did." We closed the doors and locked the truck again, even though it felt pointless. After a brief discussion, we agreed to call the police anyway. Whatever she was running from, it seemed safer to report it than to pretend it hadn't happened. We explained what we'd found, how she'd been in the truck, what she'd said, and how she'd run off. He took notes, asked a few clarifying questions, and then walked around the area with his flashlight. He didn't find anything. "There've been a few reports of trespassing around here," he said eventually. "Could be someone trying to avoid someone else, could be something else entirely." "Are you going to look for her?" I asked. He nodded. "If she doesn't want to be found, it can be hard." When we clocked out that morning, the sun was just starting to come up. I drove home, parked in front of my house, and went inside. I locked the door behind me. For a few days after that, I went to work, ran errands, lived my normal routine. The incident with the woman stayed in the back of my mind, but it didn't dominate my thoughts. I assumed the police would either find her or they wouldn't, and that would be the end of it. About a week later, on one of my nights off, I was awake late, sitting in my living room. I was watching something on my laptop when I noticed headlights passing by the front windows. Cars drove by occasionally, even at night. What caught my attention was that the same headlights came back a few minutes later. I got up and looked through the curtains. A dark car was moving slowly down the street. It passed my house, turned at the end of the block, and disappeared. I went back to what I was doing, telling myself it was nothing. 10 minutes later, the headlights came back again. This time, I stayed by the window and watched. The car slowed as it passed my house. It didn't stop, but it didn't speed up either. It just rolled by, steady and deliberate. After that, it didn't come back. I waited for a while, listening, but the street stayed quiet. Eventually, I went to bed. The next morning, after I woke up, I remembered the doorbell camera. I'd installed it after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. It recorded motion clips automatically, and I checked it occasionally out of curiosity. I opened the app on my phone and scrolled through the timeline. There were several clips from the night before. Most were nothing: passing cars, a stray cat. Then I saw one time-stamped just after midnight. I tapped it. The video showed my front porch in black and white, lit by the camera's infrared. Two figures came into view from the left side of the frame, a man and a woman. They stopped at the edge of the porch and looked around. The man was taller, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket. The woman stood slightly behind him. Even through the grainy footage, I recognized her. It was the same woman from the truck. She looked the same. Same hair, same build, same way of holding herself, tense and alert. The man said something I couldn't hear, and she nodded. They stepped up onto the porch. The man tried the doorknob. It didn't open. They stood there for a few seconds longer, scanning the yard, the street, the neighboring houses. Then they stepped back down and walked out of frame, disappearing the same way they'd come. They never rang the doorbell. I watched the clip several times, hoping I was mistaken. Each time, it felt more certain. The resemblance wasn't vague or suggestive. It was exact. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with panic, and everything to do with the sudden realization that whatever had happened at work hadn't ended there. I called the police again and told them I had footage they needed to see. An officer came by that afternoon. He watched the video carefully, asked me questions about the earlier incident, and took a copy of the footage. "Do you recognize the man?" he asked. "No," I said. "I've never seen him before." He nodded. "We'll look into it." "Do you know who they are?" I asked. "We'll see what we can find," he said. It was a careful answer, the kind that didn't promise anything. Eventually, the incident became something I thought about less often. Daniel transferred to a different shift. I moved to a new place closer to work. Years passed. The police never offered an explanation, and I never found one on my own. I'm Maya. At the time, my life was pretty ordinary in a way that only feels obvious looking back. I was working freelance, contract-based work that required short trips, nothing glamorous, just consulting and research projects that took me to different cities for a week or two at a time. I didn't have a permanent office. I worked out of hotel rooms, coffee shops, libraries, wherever I could set up a laptop and stay focused. That year, I was traveling through the Midwest for a personal project tied loosely to my work. It wasn't urgent, but it mattered to me. I had grown up in that part of the country and was revisiting places I hadn't seen in years, interviewing people, gathering records, and spending a lot of time alone. My days had a steady rhythm. Wake up early, get coffee, work for several hours, drive to wherever I needed to be, come back, make notes, sleep. The hotel I stayed in during this particular trip wasn't my first choice. It was, however, the closest option to where I needed to be the following morning. The town itself was small, but not remote. It had a courthouse, a main street with a few restaurants, and a history it was clearly proud of. The hotel sat just off that main stretch, a large brick building that looked older than most of the surrounding businesses. I'm not someone who seeks out haunted places. I don't watch ghost hunting shows, and I don't stay in hotels because they're famous for anything other than being clean and reasonably quiet. I knew, vaguely, that this hotel had a reputation. You'd have to live under a rock not to, if you grew up anywhere nearby. But it wasn't something I took seriously. Every town has a place like that, an old jail, a hospital, a hotel. Stories build up over time. That's how folklore works. When I booked the room, the website photos showed high ceilings, dark wood trim, and a lobby that looked like it hadn't been significantly renovated in decades. That didn't bother me. I actually like older buildings. They tend to be quieter, and they have a kind of solidness to them that newer places don't. I figured I'd be there one night, maybe two, and then move on. I arrived in the early evening. The front desk clerk was polite but distracted, the way someone gets when they've answered the same questions all day. There were framed black and white photographs on the walls, groups of men in suits, women in long dresses, the hotel exterior sometime in the early 20th century. Nothing unusual, nothing that felt staged or theatrical. My room was on an upper floor, toward the end of the hallway. The carpet was worn thin in places, especially near the walls. The lighting was dim but functional. When I unlocked the door, the room itself looked exactly like the photos online. A large bed, heavy curtains, a small writing desk, and a bathroom that had clearly been retrofitted sometime long after the building was constructed. I unpacked slowly. No traffic noise, no voices through the walls. That kind of quiet can feel comforting when you've been on the road for weeks. I worked for a few hours that evening, sitting at the desk with my laptop, making notes and organizing files. Around 10, I shut everything down. I took a shower, changed into a t-shirt, and got into bed with a book. I wasn't tired yet, but I wanted to be up early. The curtains covered a glass door that opened onto a narrow balcony. I hadn't gone out there. It didn't seem like much more than a decorative feature, and the door was locked anyway. The curtains themselves were heavy, the kind that don't move easily unless you pull them. At some point, I turned off the lamp and lay there in the dark, waiting to fall asleep. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't thinking about the hotel's reputation. I was thinking about the next day's schedule and whether I'd have time to stop for breakfast before my first meeting. And then, I saw a shape behind the curtains. Clear impression of a human-sized figure standing behind the curtain, close enough that the fabric bowed slightly inward. I could make out the outline of a head and shoulders. It looked like someone standing still, facing into the room. My first thought was that I was misinterpreting shadows from outside lighting. My second thought was that someone had stepped onto the balcony by mistake, maybe from a neighboring room. That didn't fully make sense, but it was the closest explanation I had. I sat up in bed and stared at it. The shape didn't move. The curtain didn't shift. After a few seconds, I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. The light filled the room immediately. The shape disappeared just as immediately. The curtain hung flat, undisturbed. I got out of bed and walked over, pulled it back, and checked the door. The balcony was empty. The door was still locked. There was no way for someone to be standing there, let alone leave without making any sound. I stood there longer than I needed to, looking out into the dark, then back at the room. I didn't feel panicked. I felt unsettled in a very specific way, like my brain was trying to correct something that didn't fit. Eventually, I told myself I was overtired. Traveling does that. Your perception gets sloppy. I closed the curtain again, locked the door a second time just to be sure, and got back into bed. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I kept replaying the image, not in a frightened way, but in a puzzled one. It bothered me that I couldn't explain it cleanly. After maybe half an hour, I decided to step into the hallway. I didn't have a clear reason for it. I think I just wanted to reset, to put myself in a different space for a minute. The hallway was empty. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I walked a few doors down, then turned back toward my room. There was a man. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, several yards away from me, with his back turned. He was tall, wearing dark clothing that looked old-fashioned in cut, though I couldn't have described it precisely if asked. What struck me immediately was how still he was, not relaxed, not shifting his weight, just standing there, facing the wall at the far end of the corridor. I slowed to a stop. I didn't say anything. I assumed he was another guest, maybe confused about which room was his, but something about him felt wrong in a way that's difficult to explain without sounding dramatic. It wasn't fear. It was a deep, physical certainty that I shouldn't get closer. I looked around the hallway, half expecting someone else to appear, maybe explain his presence. No one did. When I looked back at him, he was gone. There was nowhere he could have gone in that amount of time. The hallway was straight, with no side doors between us except guest rooms. I hadn't heard a door open or close. He hadn't walked past me. He hadn't moved at all, and then he simply wasn't there. I stood there, my heart beating faster now, trying to make sense of it. I walked to the end of the hallway and back, checking the corners, the stairwell door, the elevator. Everything was empty. At that point, I didn't want to be in the hallway anymore. I went back to my room and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, breathing slowly, telling myself that stress can do strange things to perception. That old buildings have lighting that plays tricks on your eyes. That none of this meant anything on its own. I decided to get ready for bed properly, hoping routine would help. I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth. The mirror was large and slightly clouded at the edges. As I leaned forward, toothpaste in my mouth, I saw a reflection behind me. Someone was standing just inside the bathroom doorway. I spun around immediately. The bathroom was empty. The bedroom beyond it was empty. My heart was pounding hard enough that I had to steady myself against the sink. That's when the nausea hit. It came on suddenly and intensely. I barely made it to the toilet before I started vomiting. There was no buildup, no warning. I hadn't eaten anything unusual. I hadn't felt sick earlier. When it passed, I leaned back against the tub, shaking. I tasted blood and realized my nose was bleeding, enough to drip onto the tile. I cleaned myself up mechanically. I remember thinking very clearly that something was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with imagination. I didn't try to sleep again. I packed my things as quickly and quietly as I could, shoved everything into my bag without folding, and left the room. I drove for nearly an hour before pulling over to breathe. I stayed at a different hotel in a neighboring town, one that looked aggressively modern and forgettable. The next morning, I canceled the rest of my stay and adjusted my plans. When I eventually mentioned it to a colleague, they said they'd heard similar stories about that hotel. Apparitions in the hallway, figures behind curtains, sudden illness. Later, I learned more about the building's history. Deaths, long-term residents who never really left, a fire that had been quietly minimized in official records. I don't know how much of that matters. What I do know is that I've never experienced anything like that before or since. Some places hold on to things, not in a mystical way, in a way that sinks into the walls, into the routines, into the air you breathe without noticing until it's already inside you. I'm Sandra. I was in my mid-20s, living on my own for the first time after college. I had moved back to the general area where I grew up, but not into my parents' house. I rented an apartment. I worked a standard office job, and most of my days followed the same rhythm, and weekends spent catching up with friends I hadn't seen much while I was away at school. One of those friends was someone I'd known since high school. We weren't inseparable back then, but we stayed in touch, and after I moved back, we started seeing each other more often. She lived about an hour away, closer to the edge of a rural area that gradually thinned out into wooded land and state-managed forest. Her town was small, the kind of place with one main road, a gas station, and a handful of restaurants that closed early. That particular visit wasn't special or planned far in advance. It was a casual weekend thing. I drove out in the afternoon. We had dinner, talked for hours, and watched a movie at her place. By the time I left, it was late. Not middle of the night late, but late enough that the roads were mostly empty, especially once you left town and headed toward the highways. I didn't think twice about the drive home. I'd driven those roads before, and I was used to being alone at night. My car wasn't new, but it was reliable enough, and I'd never had any serious issues with it. I had a full tank of gas, my phone was charged, and the weather was calm. There was nothing about that night that felt off while I was driving. About 20 minutes into the drive, my car started acting strangely. First, it was a soft, jerking sensation, like I'd hit uneven pavement, but the road was smooth. Then the dashboard lights flickered briefly. A few seconds later, the engine lost power, not all at once, but enough that I knew something wasn't right. I eased off the accelerator and guided the car toward the shoulder. The road I was on wasn't a highway, just a two-lane road that cut through a long stretch of forest. There were no houses nearby and no businesses. Once I stopped, the quiet settled in almost immediately. I tried restarting the car. The engine turned over but didn't catch. I tried again, slower this time, then once more. Nothing. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound of the engine cooling. My first thought was to call my friend. I knew she was still awake, and she wasn't far enough away that it would be a major inconvenience. I also considered calling roadside assistance, but I wasn't sure how long that would take out there. I decided to start with her. She answered quickly, and when I explained what was going on, she said she'd come right away. She asked where I was, and I described the road and the last intersection I'd passed. She told me to stay in the car and keep my doors locked. I said I would. After I hung up, I sat there for a few minutes with the engine off, headlights still on, phone in my lap. The silence was noticeable but not immediately frightening. I could hear insects in the trees. At some point, I realized I needed to step outside. Maybe I wanted to check the hood, or maybe I just felt restless sitting there. In hindsight, it wasn't a smart decision, but at the time it didn't feel dangerous. I locked the car behind me and stood near the driver's side, arms folded, scanning the area more out of boredom than concern. That's when I saw something in the trees. No sudden noise or obvious shape, just a subtle shift like someone adjusting their stance. Deer were common in that area, and I'd seen them cross the road plenty of times. I stared into the woods for a few seconds, trying to focus. The headlights didn't reach far enough to illuminate much beyond the edge of the trees. The darkness past that was thick and uneven. I realized the movement was too deliberate to be an animal. Someone was standing just inside the tree line. I didn't see a face at first. They weren't stepping forward or retreating. They were just there. My immediate reaction wasn't panic. I remember thinking that it was another driver who'd stopped to see if I needed help. But there was no car, no sound of an engine. I stayed where I was and called out, asking if someone was there. A few seconds passed, and then the figure stepped forward. It was a man. He came out of the trees slowly, hands visible at his sides. He looked ordinary enough at first glance. Medium height, average build, wearing dark clothes that blended in with the night. I couldn't have described his face in detail, even if I tried. Nothing about it stood out in a way that felt memorable. He stopped several feet away from me, still closer to the woods than to the road. He asked me what I was doing out there. The question caught me off guard. I told him my car had broken down and that I was waiting for a friend. He nodded, looking past me toward the car, then back at me. He didn't ask if I needed help. He didn't offer to call anyone. He just stood there for a moment, like he was thinking. Then he said that I shouldn't be out there alone at night. I agreed with him, partly because it was true, and partly because I didn't know what else to say. He took a step closer. He asked where my friend was coming from. I told him. He asked how long she'd be. I said I wasn't sure, but not long. There was nothing overtly threatening in his words, but something about the way he was asking questions felt wrong. He glanced back toward the trees behind him, then back at me. He said it would be safer if I waited off the road, where it was quieter. I didn't respond right away. He gestured toward the woods, indicating a spot just beyond where he'd come from. He said it wasn't far, and that cars sometimes came too fast around that curve. I told him I was fine where I was and that my friend would be there soon. His expression changed slightly, like irritation. He took another step forward, closing the distance more than I was comfortable with. He repeated that it would be better if I went with him. At that point, the situation shifted for me. The confusion dropped away, replaced by something colder and more focused. I told him no. I said I was staying by my car. He reached out and grabbed my arm, wrapped his hand around my forearm and applied pressure like he expected me to comply. I pulled away immediately. I remember saying no again. He tightened his grip and tried to pull me toward the trees. I started shouting and twisted free and ran back to my car. I unlocked it, got inside, and locked the doors as fast as I could. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. While it was ringing, I kept yelling, hoping someone would hear me. I laid on the horn with one hand. Through the windshield, I saw the man step back. He didn't try to approach the car. He stood there for a few seconds, watching me, then turned and walked back into the woods the same way he'd come out. By the time the dispatcher answered, he was gone. I told them where I was and what had happened, my voice shaking but steady enough that they could understand me. They told me to stay in the car and that officers were on the way. My friend arrived a few minutes later, before the police did. She pulled up behind me, headlights flooding the area, and ran to my car. I unlocked the door for her, and she got inside with me, locking it again immediately. The police arrived shortly after. They took our statements separately and searched the area around the road and the edge of the woods. They asked me to describe the man. I did my best, but the more I talked, the more I realized how little I actually remembered. Height, clothing, general build, nothing distinctive. The police never suggested anything specific, and I never pressed them for theories.